Hugh Mulcahy was an up-and-coming prospect for the Phillies. In 1936, at the age of 22, he pitched in the New York Penn League for the Hazleton Mountaineers, throwing 325 innings and was named League MVP by the Sporting News. Called up to the Phillies after that year, Mulcahy initially struggled at the major league level with a 4.83 ERA in his first 5 seasons, which was more than a half run higher than the league average at that time. But what made this even worse is that he played for the dreadful Phillies, who boasted both the worst offense and defense in the league during this time period. Being the workhorse pitcher for a team that lost over 100 games in 4 out of those 5 years meant Mulcahy racked up an impressive amount of losses, leading the league in both 1938 and 1940 and giving him the unfortunate nickname of losing pitcher. His career record after 1940 was 42 wins and 82 losses. But he was still young and showing improvement. 1940 was by far his best year, and he was only 26 years old. His ERA dropped to 3.6, he made his first All-Star team, and received MVP votes at the end of the year. Now entering his age 27 season, and the period most people consider a pitcher's prime, Mulcahy was ready to make the jump to a perennial All-Star pitcher. But events halfway across the world would throw a wrench into that. Germany, Italy, and Japan have been stirring up trouble in the late 1930s, all making considerable territorial gains through annexation and conquest to the displeasure of other world powers. But it was the invasion of France by Germany and France's capitulation in June of 1940 that caused President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to start expanding the United States military power, as it seemed inevitable that the US would be drawn into a global war. While Roosevelt still said that the US would exhaust every effort to avoid going to war, on September 16th he signed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, the first peacetime draft in US history.
It is a program, obviously, of defensive preparation, and of defensive preparation only.
Every American male between the ages of 21 and 36 were required to register for the draft. In the spring of 1941, Mulcahy and future Hall of Famer Hank Greenberg's numbers were called. Mulcahy was formally inducted into the Army on March 8, 1941, the first Major League Baseball player to be drafted and inducted into military service for World War II, but certainly not the last. Hank Greenberg's induction followed 2 months later on May 7th. Mulcahy took the news in stride, reportedly saying, "Personally, I think this conscription bill is a great thing for the young men of today," and further joking, "At least I'm on a winning team." The period of enlistment for this draft was just 1 year, meaning Mulcahy would only miss out on 1 season, and the Associated Press reported him expressing that a year away from baseball shouldn't seriously hamper his career. "I won't be 28 until September, and they say that a pitcher's prime comes between the ages of 28 and 31, so by the time I come out of the Army, I should be just about reaching my peak." The beginning of 1945 saw Mulcahy in the South Pacific, still in the Army. While there, he contracted a severe case of dysentery and lost 35 pounds. In July, he was awarded a Bronze Star and honorably discharged from the military. At the age of 32, he made his return to the major leagues. And in true Mulcahy fashion, he was the losing pitcher of record in his first game for the Phillies in a 6-5 loss to the Boston Braves. Mulcahy had missed his age 27 to 31 seasons, and he admitted on his return that he just didn't have it anymore. "I had confidence that I could pitch again in the major leagues, but being away for so long proved different. After missing about 5 years from baseball and losing 35 pounds from an illness, I lost the zip in my fastball, which was my main pitch." Mulcahy was released by the Phillies after the 1946 season. He signed with the Pirates, but was released after only 2 appearances. That would be the last time he would play in the majors. While Hugh Mulcahy was the first Major League Baseball player to serve in the military during World War II, he wouldn't be the last. The true scale of MLB players serving at this time tends to be overlooked. Over 1,300 past, current, and future Major League players at that time would serve in the military during the war. A staggering number considering only 425 total players even played in the league in 1940. Over 400 that served were players whose baseball careers had already ended by the time the US entered the war. Almost 600 were 18 and 19-year-olds that wouldn't make their MLB debuts until well after the war. Of the 425 players that played in 1940, 204 would miss time due to military service. Many times their replacements would also later get drafted. For many, military service marked the end of their careers, such as Hall of Famer Charlie Gehringer, whose last game was only weeks before he reported for duty in 1942. And Gehringer wasn't the only Hall of Famer who served. A total of 39 enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame gave up their baseball uniforms for military khakis. What I'll try to do for the rest of this video is take a deep dive into what happened during those 4 years, both at home and abroad. It's a time period that many baseball documentaries gloss over as if the league went straight from 1941 to 1946, but a lot happened during those 4 years. The constant loss of players completely changed the competitive balance among major league teams, even if it was temporary. The game itself underwent changes that we still see today. I'll also look at what many of these players did during their military service. Were they regular frontline troops, or did their baseball background get them slotted into different roles? I'll detail how baseball played a vital role, both on the home front as well as overseas, and I hope to highlight many of the interesting personal stories of these players, many of which gave up their prime playing years, with some even paying the ultimate price. All of this after the intro. This chart is what I'm going to call War Going to War. In it, we're going to track every player from every team that accumulated over 1 win above replacement the year before they joined the military, along with what year they left the league for the service, with the height of their bar correlating with their wins above replacement in their last season. With this, we can track every impactful player on the field that left for the military, when they left, how good they were, and what team they were on. We'll revisit this chart later as the war goes on, but as you can see, Mulcahy and Greenberg were really the only 2 players of consequence to miss most of the 1941 season. Yes, there were 3 other major leaguers that went into the service that year: Lou Thuman of the Nationals, Joe Gallagher of the Dodgers, and Ode Swigart of the Pirates, but those 3 were pretty far down on the depth chart. Gallagher was mostly a pinch hitter and 5th outfielder, Swigart had only pitched in 10 games in his career, and Thuman had only pitched in 5. With Mulcahy's Phillies already dreadful prior to his departure, the only big change in the standings due to military service in 1941 was Greenberg's Tigers, who went from winning the AL pennant in 1940 to dropping to 4th and finishing under 500 in 1941. 2 major storylines unrelated to the war emerged in the 1941 season. First was Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hit streak stretching from May 15th to July 16th, a feat no player has come close to matching before or since, with Willie Keeler's 45 games, the longest before DiMaggio, and Pete Rose's 44 games, the longest since. Second was Ted Williams' pursuit of a .400 batting average, something he only secured on the last day of the season, where he went 6 for 8 in a doubleheader against the Athletics to raise his batting average from .3995 to .406. Something that also has not happened since. With the looming threat of war, a nation at the tail end of the worst economic depression in its history, and 2 of baseball's biggest stars having historic years, Major League Baseball in 1941 had a bit of a resurgence. Attendance was at its highest since 1930, and almost 60% higher than 1933, the height of the Great Depression. The Yankees would run away with the AL pennant, leading the Boston Red Sox by 17 games, and would face the Dodgers in the World Series, who went 7-2 to close out the season to barely hold off the St. Louis Cardinals and win the NL pennant by 2.5 games. The Yankees won the series 4-1, with pitchers Red Ruffing, Marius Russo, and Tiny Bonham all throwing complete games with only 1 earned run apiece. But this really would be the last normal year for Major League Baseball, as there would be a massive change for the country that offseason.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 plunged the U.S. into World War II. Hank Greenberg and Hugh Mulcahy, the two players inducted into military service in the 1941 spring draft, had both received their discharge from the military just days before the attack, and both re-enlisted after the attack. Greenberg was quoted in the Sporting News, "We are in trouble, and there is only one thing for me to do: return to the service. This doubtless means I am finished with baseball, and it would be silly for me to say I do not leave it without a pang. But all of us are confronted with a terrible task: the defense of our country and the fight for our lives." Bob Feller, perhaps the best pitcher in all of baseball in the 3 seasons prior to Pearl Harbor, was driving from Iowa to Chicago when he got the news. Feller called his Navy recruiter, who flew into Chicago, met Feller at the courthouse, and signed him up with the Navy at 8 a.m. on December 9th. Feller would be the first Major League Baseball player to voluntarily enlist after the attack. But Pearl Harbor raised a very big question for Major League Baseball. During World War I, there was a federal mandate in 1918 that required all men with non-essential jobs to either enlist or take war-related jobs, giving Major League Baseball until September 2nd to meet the mandate. The league decided to cut the season short on that date. Now that the U.S. was entering another world war, would Major League Baseball even exist? Baseball's commissioner, Judge Landis, tactfully waited a month after Pearl Harbor before broaching the subject to President Roosevelt. In a handwritten letter, Landis wrote to Roosevelt, "The time is approaching when, in ordinary conditions, our teams would be heading for spring training camps. However, inasmuch as these are not ordinary times, I venture to ask what you have in mind as to whether professional baseball should continue to operate." Of course, my inquiry does not relate to all the individual members of this organization whose status, in the emergency, is fixed by law operating upon all citizens. Health and strength to you, and whatever else it takes to do this job. Roosevelt's response was quick. Just the next day, he released what would be referred to as the Green Light Letter. I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. There will be fewer people unemployed, and everybody will work longer hours and harder than ever before. And that means that they ought to have a chance for recreation and for taking their minds off their work even more than before. Baseball provides a recreation which does not last over 2 hours or 2 hours and a half, and which can be got for very little cost. The public echoed Roosevelt's opinion. A Gallup poll in early 1942 reported that 66% believed that professional sports should continue during the war, while 24% said they shouldn't. Even servicemen generally agreed, with the Sporting News saying, "What about the views of the men in service?" In the answer, the question whether baseball should be continued during the war, there came back a thunderous yes, uttered by hundreds of militant voices. Most of the men responding to the question laid stress on the fact that baseball was part of the American way of living and that something would be missing if the game was not carried on. PFC Wayne Ashworth's letter to the Sporting News read, "Baseball discontinued. Would you like to discontinue the use of salt and pepper on your eggs, dressing on your salad, icing on your cakes, and catsup or mustard on your hot dogs? Discontinue baseball and you remove something from our morale, something that only baseball fills." So it seemed Major League Baseball would continue during the war. Roosevelt's Green Light Letter also added, "I hope that night games can be extended because it gives an opportunity to the day shift to see a game occasionally." Night baseball games were a relatively new concept that many owners, and Judge Landis himself, viewed with suspicion. While embraced at the minor league level, 70% of minor league games were night games by 1941, night games were few and far between at the major league level. The Cincinnati Reds hosted the first night game in 1935, and they ended up playing 7 night games that year, one against every National League opponent. But another team didn't join them in hosting a night game until 3 years later when the Brooklyn Dodgers had their first night game, coincidentally hosting the Reds. Also coincidentally, it was Johnny Vandermeer's second straight no-hitter, the only time a pitcher has ever had consecutive no-hitters. The resistance by the league to more night games was for a number of speculative reasons. Some believed it would be bad for the eyesight of the players, as well as attract a less than desirable fan base, as it wouldn't be the family-friendly environment that day games provided. But to the owners' delight, they found out night games brought in a lot more money. The St. Louis Browns played 14 night games in 1940, and drew nearly as many fans in those 14 games as they did in their other 63 home games played that year combined. They had 6 home games that year with an attendance over 10,000. 5 of them were night games. However, the league was still against night games at the time and limited teams to only 7 for the 1941 season. Many stadiums, such as Yankee Stadium and Wrigley Field, didn't even have lights installed. Yankees executive Ed Barrow said, "If night ball is stopped, I will not be the one to cry. It's a wart on the nose of the game." But President Roosevelt himself urging the league to play more night games couldn't be ignored, and the league allowed all teams to have up to 14 night games in 1942, with the Washington Nationals getting an exception to play 21. Many servicemen overseas also supported night games, with Private Jack Kiger in the Pacific writing to the Sporting News. "During blackout hours over here at night, it is a comforting thought to us to know that our family and friends are seeing our teams play at night under thousands of lights in the old country where night baseball is a possibility. We all have a job to do. Keep them playing over there, and we'll keep them flying over here." There were some issues with night games though. With German U-boats targeting US shipping in the Atlantic, there was fear that lit-up cities would silhouette ships, making them easy targets. A dim-out rule was put in place on the East Coast where cities were allowed only 1 hour of artificial light after sunset. This led the New York Giants and Brooklyn Dodgers to host dusk games that started in daylight and ended under the lights. The Washington Nationals, who wanted to play more than the 21 night games allotted to them, tried to use the dusk games as a loophole that didn't count as night games. But American League President William Harridge ruled that dusk games would count against their night game quota. Over the next 2 years, the owners began to realize the perceived negative aspects of night games were overblown, if not entirely fabricated, and also realized they had much higher attendance and brought in much more money. In 1944, the league approved unlimited night games for each team. There were still opponents to night games, with even the great Babe Ruth warning that night games would ruin players' eyes, give them colds, and deprive them of sleep, with Ed Barrow stating, "I am more convinced than ever that there is absolutely no future in electric lighted play." At the end of the war, the owners that were vocal opponents of night games tried to reinstate a limit, but were outvoted by the rest of the owners. Roosevelt's letter, as well as the realization that night games equal more money, won out in the end. Night games have been a staple of Major League Baseball ever since. 1942 saw a few more significant departures from the league than just Mulcahy and Greenberg. The previously mentioned Bob Feller from the Cleveland Indians, but also Cecil Travis and Buddy Lewis from the Washington Nationals, Johnny Rigney from the White Sox, Sam Chapman and Benny McCoy from the Philadelphia Athletics. But none of those 4 teams finished above 500 in 1941. The only good team to see a significant departure was the Red Sox with Mickey Harris. But they still had stars Ted Williams, Joe Cronin, Jimmy Fox, Bobby Doerr, and Charlie Wagner to carry them in 1942. The 3 runaway best teams in the league in 1941, the New York Yankees, the St. Louis Cardinals, and the Brooklyn Dodgers, were left mostly untouched for 1942. If anything, MLB losing players to the military for the 1942 season ended up just making the bad teams in the league even worse, while the powerhouse teams got relatively better. The Yankees, Cardinals, and Dodgers, who had the 3 best records in the league in 1941, all had higher win totals in 1942, with the 1942 World Series matchup of the Yankees versus the Cardinals. The Cardinals won in 5 games. Post-Pearl Harbor, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 was amended to declare all males ages 18 to 38 eligible for the draft. It was previously limited to ages 21 to 36. But it wasn't that simple. When reporting to a draft board, a person would be labeled one of many different classifications. These classifications consisted of a number and a letter. The numbers would range from 1 to 4, with 1 being available for service, 2 having a deferment due to occupational status, 3 having a deferment due to dependence, and 4 having a deferment either by law or due to being unfit for service. And the letters would be a subclassification. The classifications for each potential recruit were set by each draft board, and the standards for each draft board varied wildly in both location and time period. The requirements and recommendations for who should get deferred seemed to change monthly based on public sentiment as well as manpower needs. In 1942, the pecking order for drafting someone was: first, single men with no dependents; second, single men with collateral dependents such as parents but without a job that contributed to the war effort; third, single men with collateral dependents and a job that did contribute to the war effort; fourth, married men without children and without a contributing job; fifth, married men without children but with a contributing job; sixth, married men with children but without a contributing job; and seventh, married men with children and a job that contributed to the war effort. President Roosevelt included in the green light letter: as to the players themselves, I know you agree with me that individual players who are of active military or naval age should go, without question, into the services. Even if the actual quality of the teams is lowered by the greater use of older players, this will not dampen the popularity of the sport. Of course, if any individual has some particular aptitude in a trade or profession, he ought to serve in the government. Roosevelt's letter made it clear that playing Major League Baseball would not be considered a job that contributed to the war effort, so 3, 5, and 7 were out for ball players. But on top of that drafting order, nearly a third of all men that were drafted were rejected and classified as 4F, meaning physically, mentally, or morally unfit, with about 30% of the rejections being just for foot problems such as flat feet. For public perception, 4F became more than just a military fitness classification. It became somewhat of an insult to someone's manliness, and 4Fs were portrayed as weak in popular media. Baseball players that were deferred, both 4F and other classifications, were not immune to this ridicule.
Well, here we are at the first game of the series between the Yankee Doodlers and the Draft Dodgers. Players have taken their positions. Oop, forgot about the war. Oh, well, we still have our pitcher.
Many in the public, understandably, criticized how someone could possibly be physically fit enough to play a professional sport, but not physically fit enough to serve in the military. Ed McCauley of the Cleveland News wrote, "If your next-door neighbor were deferred on account of pyorrhea, which is a type of gum disease, you'd think nothing of it. If a ball player were deferred on the same grounds, you'd write your congressman." In 1943, MLB offered to send 2 teams to the South Pacific as sort of a USO tour for troops, but it was called off by the Secretary of War Henry Stimson because he felt that the troops would resent the sight of apparently healthy ball players not in a service uniform. Ted Williams was classified as 3A, meaning he was deferred due to dependence. Williams was his mother's sole means of support at the time. After Pearl Harbor, his classification was changed to 1A without his input. He appealed to his draft board to change his status back to 3A with the promise that after another year on a major leaguer's salary, he'd save up enough money to support his mother and would join the Navy. The draft board agreed, giving Williams his 3A status and deferred him for a year. Ben Bradley, journalist for the Boston Globe, wrote, "The Williams deferment quickly became topic A in Boston and beyond, and would remain a major story in the papers for months. It had all the elements, a whiff of favoritism, and the shirking of duty at a time of overwhelming national unity and surging patriotism, self-interest versus the national interest. It even got to the point where Quaker Oats canceled an endorsement deal with Williams, which Williams did not react well to. In his autobiography, Williams stated, 'I haven't had a Quaker Oat since.'" Joe DiMaggio was also front page news after the 1942 season because his marriage to and child with actress Dorothy Arnold gave him deferment status, and there were rumors that they were getting divorced, which would potentially remove that deferment. A joke at the time was the Yankees manager was offering to pay for a marriage counselor for DiMaggio to keep him with the team. Regardless, DiMaggio also got his share of criticism. A letter to the sports editor of the New York Times was published saying, "Men have been drafted into the Army who have never earned more than a small salary in civilian life, who have no sideline returns to fall back on, and who had wives and children to support. On the other hand, especially in baseball, there are quite a few too many high-salaried players, some of them with businesses on the side, who have been exempted from the service. A case in point is Joe DiMaggio of the Yankees. Why he was ever exempted from service is beyond comprehension. Not that he is the only one, however. It seems to me that men well known in the sport should take the lead in volunteering for their country in time of need and not wait to be drafted, much less accept exemption. Both Williams and DiMaggio put an end to the public scrutiny by voluntarily enlisting and reporting for duty after the 1942 season. Despite the public scrutiny of athletes being draft dodgers, there weren't really any proven examples where athletes were actively unfairly seeking deferment. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover even released a statement saying if any ball players or other athletes were attempting to dodge service, it would be our job to look into such cases. But our records show there are few, if any, such cases among the thousands of ball players, and they are entitled to a clean bill of health. On the contrary, many ball players either voluntarily enlisted despite being eligible for deferment, or in the case of being granted 4F status, actively sought out to have that status overturned. The previously mentioned Bob Feller was 2C, which would have given him a deferment if he wanted it because it classified him as a farmer. This was due to his father having cancer in 1936 and Feller having to take care of the family farm. But he told his family he wouldn't take advantage of this classification, saying, "When it's time for me to do the job, I'm ready to do the job. When they want me, I'll go." Johnny Rigney of the White Sox was originally drafted in 1941, but was deferred due to a perforated eardrum. After Pearl Harbor, it seemed a perforated eardrum wasn't enough to keep him out, and Rigney was inducted into the Navy. Red Ruffing was 38 years old, had an off-season job working at a military manufacturer, which should have been enough for a 2B deferment, had a wife and a kid to support as well as a mother-in-law, which should have been enough for a 3B deferment, and was missing 4 toes on his left foot from a coal mining accident as a kid, a physical disability that would get any non-baseball player 4F status. After being reviewed multiple times by Army doctors and given a clear 4F status, Ruffing kept seeking additional opinions until the last Army doctor that reviewed him wrote in his report, "What he could do on the outside, he could do on the inside. I would have drafted any ball player." And so Ruffing went into the Army. Overall though, players leaving Major League Baseball for the military posed a relatively minor impact to the on-field product in both the 1941 and 1942 seasons. That would not be the case for 1943.
On land, at sea, and in the air, 170 American League players are serving the country. From the National League, 155 men have entered the armed forces. These men have doffed baseball uniforms for those of the Army, for the fighting uniform of the Navy. They're serving in the Marine Corps. Some are in the Coast Guard. Others are flying the planes of the Navy and of the Army Air Force. And to them and their fellow fighters overseas, Babe Ruth, the great Bambino who blasted 714 home runs in his Major League career, broadcasts a pre-game message.
I want to say from the bottom of my heart and from the hearts of every American, that I want to say God bless you great men and women over there, and God bless the ones that are going over. And if we fight as half as hard as you're fighting over there, that American flag will fly forever.
The Yankees took major blows to their roster with stars Joe DiMaggio, Phil Rizzuto, Tommy Henrich, and Red Ruffing leaving for military service. But they still had one of the deepest systems of minor and major league talent, the deepest pocketbook of any team, as well as some ingenuity to fill the gaps. Johnny Lindell was a relief pitcher for the Yankees in 1942, which at the time being a relief pitcher meant you were pretty low on the depth chart. While the Yankees pitching staff stayed mostly intact, their offense was ravaged by military departures. With major holes in the lineup, the Yankees decided to convert Lindell from pitcher to outfielder, a position he hadn't played since the minor leagues in 1938, 5 years prior. But desperate times call for desperate measures. To his credit, Lindell stepped up, making the All-Star team that year. The experiment was so successful that Lindell remained an outfielder even after the war, with his best season coming in 1944, where he hit over 100 RBIs and received MVP votes. He would convert back to pitcher at the end of his career in 1953, once his hitting skills had left him. Players that had been blocked by the deep Yankee system also got their chance to shine. Billy Johnson signed with the Yankees organization in 1936, and despite hitting .315 in the minor leagues from 1937 to 1942, he never got his chance to play on the Major League Ball Club. That changed in 1943 as Johnson became the everyday third baseman, batted third in the lineup for much of the year, and finished fourth in MVP voting. But even with their departures, even with having to fill holes, the Yankees were so deep that they still had many powerhouse players from the previous year, including Hall of Famers Bill Dickey and Joe Gordon, offensive leader Charlie Keller, 1942 20-game winner Tony Bonham, and ace pitcher Spud Chandler, who would go on to win the 1943 MVP with a league-leading 1.64 ERA. While they didn't win as many games as they did in 1942, dropping from 103 to 98, they still ran away with the American League pennant, finishing 13.5 games ahead of the second-place Washington Nationals. Their main competition for the pennant in 1942, the Red Sox, did not weather their losses of Ted Williams, Dom DiMaggio, and Johnny Pesky nearly as well, dropping from 93 wins to just 68. And in the National League, the Cardinals dominated, led by 23-year-old Stan Musial, who had a very low draft priority due to having a son before Pearl Harbor, and supporting both of his parents. The Cardinals finished with a Major League best 105 wins, a full 18 games ahead of the second-place Cincinnati Reds in the National League. Musial clearly took the title as the new best player in baseball, leading the league in hits, doubles, triples, batting average, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, and OPS, and took home the National League MVP. The 1943 World Series would be a rematch of the 1942 World Series, Yankees versus the Cardinals, in a 3 games in New York and then 4 games in St. Louis format due to wartime travel restrictions. They didn't need all 7 games as the Yankees won the series 4-1. While the 1943 season again had some changes and loss of talent due to military service, the increasing manpower requirements for the US military, especially with the pending invasion of Europe and necessary Pacific campaign, meant the 1943 offseason would see talented players inducted into the military at an unseen level, and the Yankees were hit harder than any other team. Already down DiMaggio, Rizzuto, Henrich, Hassett, and Ruffing, 5 of their top 6 players in terms of wins above replacement in 1943 would not be in the league in 1944. And it wasn't just the Yankees. 40 players who accumulated at least 1 win above replacement in 1943 would miss most of, if not all, of 1944. This is on top of the 52 players who accumulated at least 1 win above replacement in previous years that were already in the service. At this point, all teams were affected, except one. One team that had been a basement dweller for nearly their entire existence, dating back to 1902, was nearly untouched. Not a single player of 1 or more win above replacement had departed the team the previous 3 years, and they wouldn't lose any for 1944 either. It was time for the St. Louis Browns to shine. On the surface, it would seem odd that the Browns didn't lose any players of importance when there was nearly 200 major leaguers now serving in the military. Was there something nefarious going on? Were they bribing local draft boards? The explanation is much simpler than that. The Browns had always been a dreadful team made up of the cast-offs from the rest of the league, players that were considered over the hill or past their prime. They were already the oldest team in the league in both 1942 and 1943, and nearly their entire roster was married. And the thing about older men that were married is they tended to get draft deferrals. The Browns weren't, however, the oldest team in 1944. With so many teams losing their main players, they searched for ex-major leaguers possibly wanting to come back and play, or calling up aging rookies that had languished in the minors for years. With how the Browns were constructed, they had a leg up in having many of the top older players. The Browns were also not picky. Mike Krivich was an outfielder for the Athletics in 1942, but was released after the season because he drank too much. Browns manager Luke Sewell, who had played with Krivich previously, thought he was a good enough player to contribute to the Browns, and also thought he could keep Krivich sober. Sewell told Krivich before the season, "Mike, we can use you, but only if you're sober. If you don't stay sober, I'm gonna have to release you." Krivich agreed and signed with the Browns, and Sewell put some insurances in place. I had a friend, one of the originators of Alcoholics Anonymous. I got a hold of him, and he helped me get a hold of a fellow who got a hold of Mike, and he got straightened out. Pitcher Nelson Potter had struggled on the Athletics and Red Sox in the late 30s and early 40s and was relegated to the minors after a failed surgery on torn cartilage in his knee. The surgeon actually removed the wrong cartilage. But in 1942, he started to show some life with the AA Louisville Colonels with a 2.60 ERA, and his knee seemed to have fully healed. The Browns picked up Potter from the Red Sox in the Rule 5 draft before 1943, and Potter quickly became one of the best pitchers in the league, throwing 655 innings with a 2.68 ERA from 1943 to 1945. Most importantly, his knee problems gave him 4F status. Nelson Potter was good, but arguably Jack Kramer was the ace of the staff. He had struggled on the Browns from 1939 to 1941, putting up a 5.79 ERA, and had missed 1942 due to military service joining the Navy Seabees, but was medically discharged in 1943 due to asthma. Going back to the Browns, he was sent to the minors and seemingly blossomed overnight. The 25-year-old put up a 2.46 ERA, won 8 games in a row, and threw a no-hitter for the Toledo Mud Hens. He got the call back to the Browns for the 1944 season and pitched like one of the best pitchers in the league, a 2.49 ERA with a 17-13 record in 257 innings pitched. Vern Stevens was the Browns' star shortstop. He was only 23 years old and had made the All-Star team in 1943. To go with the Browns' continued luck, he had failed his Army physical and was yet another 4F on the team. In 1944, he would lead the league in RBIs and finish third in MVP voting. Pitcher Denny Galehouse was deferred because he worked at a Goodyear aircraft factory in Akron, Ohio. In order for the Browns to use him in 1944, he worked his job at the factory and only pitched on weekends. Galehouse said of the arrangement, "We worked 6 days a week, sometimes as much as 65 or 70 hours. On Saturday, I'd get an overnight train to wherever the Browns were playing. I'd get there at 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd have breakfast and go to the ballpark. There wasn't any place else to go. We always had Sunday doubleheaders. I'd pitch the first game and then I'd leave and take the train to go back home." The Browns season was shaping up well as they were ahead of the Red Sox by 2.5 games going into the All-Star break. And Galehouse, seeing the team had a chance at the pennant, checked with his draft board to see how long it would take for him to get inducted if he were to quit his factory job. When he was told it probably wouldn't be until after the season, he quit his job and became a full-time starter for the second half. He would finish the season with a 3.12 ERA and 153 innings pitched. This ragtag group of 4Fs and older veterans proved to be the recipe for success in 1944. Falling 1.5 games behind the Tigers with only 12 games left to play on the season, the Browns went on to win 11 of those 12 games and secured their first ever AL pennant on the final game of the season by beating the Yankees 5-2, finishing 1 game ahead of the Tigers. As far as the National League was concerned, the Cardinals still had Stan Musial in 1944, which with the depleted major leagues at that point was pretty much all you needed. Now that begs the question, how had Musial avoided the draft? He was 23 years old, healthy, and seemed to be a prime candidate for military service. This is where the unevenness of the local draft boards came into play. While Musial was married, had children born before Pearl Harbor, and worked in a war plant in the off-season, many players older than Musial with larger families hadn't avoided the draft. Local draft boards had a quota on how many soldiers they needed to draft, and by luck of the draw, Donora, Pennsylvania had easily met their quota before Musial's number needed to be called. He would eventually be inducted into the Navy after the 1944 season, but for that year, he was the king of the league. Led the league in hits, on-base percentage, slugging, and OPS, and led the Cardinals to a league-best 105 wins, finishing a full 14.5 games ahead of the second-place Pittsburgh Pirates. So the teams were set. The 1944 World Series would be between the St. Louis Browns and the St. Louis Cardinals, who both played their home games at Sportsman Park. Dubbed the Streetcar Series, it would be the last World Series played entirely in one stadium until the 2020 COVID pandemic would see the World Series played at a neutral site. The Cardinals ended up winning the series in 6 games and were World Series champs for the second time in 3 years. Outside of the Browns having the best season in their team's history, the shortage of players in 1944 caused a few more changes to the league, including the Cincinnati Reds signing a very, very young player. Joe Nuxhall was only 15 years old and playing amateur baseball in Hamilton, Ohio, when a Cincinnati Red scout, who was visiting to scout his dad, saw Nuxhall on the mound, which led to the Reds giving him a contract. Nuxhall said of this, "There was a lot of publicity about me signing a Cincinnati contract, the youngest ever to sign a contract. I was part of the Reds roster until school let out in June. I would just come down on weekends and for night games. I only made 1 road trip with the team. I'm sitting there, and the Cardinals are just killing us.
So I'm sitting on the bench and watching the game, and I'm admiring the way the Cardinals are hitting the baseball. And all of a sudden, I hear this voice say, "Joe." He says, "Go warm up." And now I'm nervous now, but not near as bad as I'm going to be. And I've made the first 2 steps, and I tripped over the third one, and I've landed flat on my face. So the first batter up, I went 3-2 on him, and he grounded to short. The next batter, I'm 0-2, and I wind up walking him. The next batter, I'm 3-2, and he pops up to shortstops. And the fourth batter, I'm 0-2 on him, and then I realize exactly where in the world I am. This is the St. Louis Cardinals, Crosley Field. And from that point on, I walk him, and then Stan comes up. First pitch I threw, he had a screaming Mimi, as we like to say, to right field. I mean, an absolute bullet. And from that point on, I walked 3 more, give up 1 more hit and a wild pitch, and that was it. And the next day, Mr. Giles was the boss man then. He said, "We're going to send you to Birmingham, Alabama."
He didn't pitch again that year, but returned to the Reds 8 years later and went on to have a 16-year career, making 2 All-Star teams. Nuxhall still holds the record for the youngest player to play Major League Baseball. There was a bit of a sea change when it came to drafting players into the military at the beginning of 1945. The Director of War Mobilization and Reconstruction, James Burns, told draft boards to re-examine all professional athletes who were classified as 4F. Burns stated, "It is difficult for the public to understand, and certainly is difficult for me to understand, how these men can be physically unfit for military service and yet be able to compete with the greatest athletes of the nation in games demanding physical fitness." There were 260 4F players in the major leagues at that time, and all were up for re-evaluation, which really put owners in a situation where they didn't know who they'd have come opening day. Ron Northey was the first to be drafted under these re-examinations. Northey didn't complain but stated, "It was not my fault that I was not in the Army long ago. Now that I'm here, I want to do my part, the same as any other American, to get this war over in a hurry." Hugh Poland, backup catcher for the Boston Braves, had previously voluntarily enlisted but had been rejected due to torn ligaments and chipped bones in his right ankle from an injury in high school. When re-examined at a draft board in 1945, he was initially rejected a second time until an officer realized he was a professional athlete. When asked how he played baseball with his messed up ankle, Poland explained that he taped it up before games. With that, the officer said, "Okay, you're in." But there was some pushback to draft boards targeting athletes in early 1945. Congressman C. Melvin Price stated, "The ball clubs were being raided of playing talent. One part of the official government line was that they wanted the sports to continue to provide relaxation and so forth. But what was actually happening was that if you were an athlete, you were automatically qualified for military service. It pretty much endangered the future of baseball. You were getting to the point where it could have been closed before the end of the war. I wasn't trying to keep any able-bodied guys out of the service. They shouldn't treat them any differently from anybody else. But if they had a disability that would normally disqualify them, they should be disqualified." In May, the War Department suspended the practice of re-evaluating 4F athletes, but not before a number of players were inducted into the service, including the previously mentioned Northey, as well as Walker Cooper and Stan Spence. With so many players now gone into the military, with even the St. Louis Browns starting to lose players and the Cardinals losing Stan Musial, it was anybody's guess who would be the best team in 1945. The shortage of able-bodied players also led to a number of disabled athletes appearing in 1945. Bert Shepard was a pilot in the Army Air Force and was shot down in Germany in May of 1944. Captured by the Germans, he had to have his leg amputated due to a shell tearing right through his foot. In February 1945, he returned to the States in a prisoner exchange. He was signed as a pitching coach for the Washington Senators, and in August, he made an appearance as a pitcher in a big league game. Pete Gray lost his arm at 6 years old from a farming accident. Even minus an arm, Gray still grew up playing baseball. Rejected from military service due to his amputation, and with the major league team struggling to find players, Gray gave it a shot. In 1944, playing for the Memphis Chickasaws, Gray hit .333 with 5 home runs and was awarded Most Valuable Player of the Southern Association. He signed with the St. Louis Browns for $20,000 and played in 77 games for them in 1945, hitting .218 with 0 home runs. There was even a made-for-TV movie about Gray in 1986 called A Winner Never Quits. His teammates were not too happy, as they went into the season thinking they would compete for the pennant again, and Gray seemed more like a ploy to sell tickets by the owners instead of competing. Outfielder Mike Krivich, who Gray often replaced in the lineup, quit baseball altogether, stating, "If I'm not playing well enough so that a one-arm man can take my job, I quit." Manager Luke Sewell stated, "When I got him, I knew he couldn't make it. He didn't belong in the major leagues, and he knew he was being exploited. They were trying to get a gated traction in St. Louis. A lot of people got mad because I didn't keep playing him." Third baseman Mark Chrisman said of Gray, "Pete did great with what he had, but he cost us the pennant in 1945. Dick Cypek played for the Reds in 1945. He was the first deaf player in the major league since Billy Hoy in 1902. The league wouldn't see another deaf player until Curtis Pride in 1993. Unlike Gray, whose disability was plain to see, Cypek was not a gate attraction and went relatively unnoticed. He fit in much better with his teammates than Gray, though, some of them even learning sign language.
I played baseball in Major League. Wow, it was just overwhelming, and I met so many different people. I had to do my best when I played, so to show them that the deaf can do.
While many teams were struggling to put together a roster, one of the best teams from before the war saw a major boon. Hank Greenberg, having served 4 years in the Army Air Force, was discharged in June of 1945 and immediately returned to the Tigers. Greenberg, along with pitcher Hal Newhouser, who was AL MVP in both 1944 and 1945, he was 4F due to a leaky heart valve, won the AL pennant and went on to beat the Chicago Cubs in the World Series in 7 games. On August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrendered to the United States, ending World War II. 1946 would be a wild ride for Major League Baseball, as all the players out of the league the last 4 years would return at the same time. It would be anybody's guess on who managed to stay in shape while in the military, which replacement players would stick around, which major leaguers were now past their prime, and who would be on the rosters for 1946. So we have a league where hundreds of quality players have been gone from anywhere from 1 to 4 years. Would all of these players returning from the military in 1946 just get their jobs back? The main thing working against the veteran players wasn't that they were out of practice playing baseball. If anything, they weren't, something I'll get into later in this video. But age was the biggest issue. Of the 125 players on the War Going to War chart, the average age in 1946 was over 31 years old. Many of the players that went into the military were already in the twilight of their careers, and World War II just really made it final. Buddy Hassett of the Yankees, Lee Grissom of the Phillies, Merrill May of the Phillies, Larry French of the Dodgers, and Harry Danning of the Giants were 5 older players who never played in the majors again after their military service. There were another 38 players whose careers were over by the end of 1947. The average age of those 38 players in 1946 was 35 years old. This includes Hall of Famers Ted Lyons, Billy Herman, Bill Dickey, Red Ruffing, and even Hank Greenberg. Then there were those players whose military service directly impacted their ability to play. There's the previously mentioned Hugh Mulcahy, as well as Charlie Wagner, who, like Mulcahy, had dysentery while overseas and returned physically unable to play at the same level. Perhaps the biggest victim of this was Cecil Travis, who was an All-Star in 1941, finished 3rd in MVP voting, and led the league in hits. While serving in Europe with the 76th Infantry Division, he developed frostbite on his foot during the Battle of the Bulge, which required an operation. He said of the battle, "Heck, you was in that snow and you was out in that weather, and you was lucky you got to stay in an old barn at night. The thing about it, you'd sit there in those boots and you might not get 'em off for days at a time. And cold, you'd shake at night. Your feet would start swelling, and that's how you'd find out there was something really wrong. You'd pull your boots off, and your feet is swelling." Travis earned a Bronze Star with 4 battle stars during the war, one of the most decorated players on this chart, but his frostbite injury severely hampered the rest of his baseball career. He had 218 hits at the age of 27 in 1941. He would only manage 174 hits the rest of his career, which ended in 1947. Travis said upon his return to baseball, "I ain't got no cat in me no more." But for the most part, veteran players did get their jobs back. This was probably helped by the fact that the minor leagues were completely depleted of talent and of teams during the war. With minor leaguers usually younger than major leaguers and less likely to be married or have children, they were drafted into the service at a much higher rate, and the minor leagues were massive in 1940. There were 43 leagues, 159 affiliated teams, and over 5,000 minor leaguers in total. In August of 1941, when only 5 major leaguers were in the service, and really only 2 that were impactful major leaguers, there were 193 minor league players in the military. In total, over 3,000 minor leaguers would serve during the war. With so many being drafted or at a minimum taking jobs that helped the war effort, and later in the war, the few decent minor leaguers still around were getting called up to the majors to replace major leaguers that had left, the minor leagues struggled to field teams that the public would want to watch. There were 43 minor leagues and 159 affiliated teams in 1940. By 1943, there were only 9 minor leagues still in operation and only 46 affiliated teams. This state of affairs helped returning veterans because there was not a lot of minor leaguers that had properly spent time honing their skills and ready for a major league call-up in 1946. Similar to how the 2020 COVID pandemic canceled the minor league season and delayed the development and call-up for many minor leaguers, World War II effectively did the same. While the average age of the league did drop in 1946 compared to 1945, it was still well above the average age in 1941. The league's average age would continue to drop after 1946 as the minor leagues returned to pre-war levels and would finally get down to the same league average age as before the war in 1950. It took 5 years after the war before the league returned to the same development cycle of players. It's difficult to stress how important baseball was not only to morale, but for the war effort overall, especially when it came to fundraising. In 1942, Major League Baseball played 2 All-Star games. The first was the regular American League versus National League, but the second All-Star game pitted the winner of the first against the Service All-Stars, highlighted by pitcher Bob Feller, with the proceeds going to war charities. The game raised $100,000 to buy baseball equipment for military recreation, $60,000 for Army and Navy relief funds, and $60,000 worth of war bonds. And that was just the beginning. Shirley Povich wrote in the Washington Post, "The war effort was total. Everybody was in a passion to win this war. Our heroes, so-called, were in the armed services. What do we do on the home front? Well, everything we can. So we got the bright idea of having a game to sell war bonds. We pegged it to the idea that if we could fill the park, we could buy a United States cruiser. That was the target. So many $1 million to buy a cruiser for the Navy. I put in motion the idea that we could have a game between the Senators and the Navy All-Stars, most of whom were operating out of Norfolk and Newport News. Bob Feller pitched at Norfolk. Paget was down there catching, Phil Rizzuto, Benny McCoy. They had all the big leaguers. The Navy agreed to the game. Every admission would be a war bond. If you bought a $50 bond, I think you got a general admission seat. If you bought a $1,000 bond, you got 1 box seat. I got Bing Crosby to come down and sing behind second base, and Kate Smith to come down and sing God Bless America. Did I pay them? Absolutely not. Not even expenses. It was no trouble getting them. Everybody responded to these things during the war. All you had to do was ask. Povich's efforts for that game in 1943 raised over $2 million for the war effort. In August of 1943, the 3 New York teams combined rosters to play against a team of Army All-Stars, including Hank Greenberg, Enos Slaughter, and Sid Hudson. But perhaps the biggest draw of the event was appearances by retired Hall of Famers Babe Ruth and Walter Johnson, who faced each other for the first time since 1927. The game raised $800 million in war bond pledges. There were dozens of benefit games staged by major and minor league teams to raise money for war bonds, the USO, the Red Cross, and the Army and Navy relief agencies. There were all kinds of wartime collection drives. Kitchen grease was collected and recycled, and the Louisville Colonels of the American Association collected 2,857 pounds of grease at a waste fat night. The Cincinnati Reds collected cigarettes instead of tickets at a Smokes for Servicemen benefit game. Shreveport had an aluminum night where fans could bring in scrap aluminum to donate to the war effort, and some fans found at the end of the event, when they got back to their cars, that other fans had donated their aluminum hubcaps. Each Major League team had one home game a year as a benefit for the Army and Navy relief funds. These games netted $506,000 for war charities in 1942, $326,500 in 1943, and $328,500 in 1944. Baseball's monetary contribution to the war effort wasn't just limited to special events and exhibition games. Players and officials took 10% of their pay in war bonds. Servicemen in uniform were allowed to attend games free in most cities. The league mandated that half the proceeds from the World Series would be donated to the Army-Navy relief. Bill DeWitt, general manager for the Browns, complained after the 1944 season, "Here we are losing money, and for once we get a chance to make some money in the World Series, and we have to give half of it away." This may have played a part into why the Browns punted on competing in 1945, instead focusing on regular season gate attractions, like playing a one-armed man in the outfield. These contributions to the war effort may have even impacted the game itself, and not just through players entering the military. Baseball covers at the time were made of horsehide imported from Belgium and France. With both countries now occupied and wartime restrictions in full effect, the A.G. Spalding Company had to redesign the ball. They created what would be referred to as the Balata ball, Balata being a rubber-like material used in golf ball production. Players describe this new ball as being dead as a rock, and the drop in offensive numbers support this. 1943 saw the lowest league-wide home run rates since 1920. 1943, 1944, and 1945 would be the last time the league would see home run rates under 0.4 per game. The home run rate would double by 1950, and the recent juice ball era saw rates over triple that amount. Runs per game also saw a significant decrease throughout the war. Spalding claimed at the time that the problems with the ball were due to wartime restrictions on rubber, causing them to use a lower quality reprocessed rubber in the ball. Overall, baseball's support for the war was monumental. In November of 1943, Senator Scott Lucas said, "Since Pearl Harbor, organized baseball has turned in $3,128,698 to war charities and over $1 billion in war bond sales." Final estimates after the war were that baseball contributed over $2.9 billion to war charities. What did Major League players actually do in the military? The question that comes to the forefront is, did Major League Baseball players avoid combat more than the average military recruit in World War II? The answer to this, for the most part, is yes. In total, just over 16 million Americans served in the military during World War II, with about 417,000 killed in action, a rate of around 2.5%. There were 747 players with Major League Baseball experience that served in the military during the war, with 2 killed in action, a rate of 0.26%, meaning MLB players were 10 times less likely to be killed in action. What's the reason for this? Were they put in easy roles? Was there favoritism? The main reason is the military saw a benefit in baseball. Benefits for physical fitness, morale, and fundraising. Dick Bartell of the New York Giants explains, "Baseball stiffens morale and helps keep the gobs from running over to the mainland where they might get too familiar with cocktail bars and such." Most military bases and units had a baseball team during the war. Historian William B. Meade wrote in the book Even the Browns, Baseball During World War II, "America's best baseball teams during the war may not have been in the major leagues at all, but rather in the Army and Navy. The Navy was particularly adept at stationing its outstanding players at Norfolk, Virginia, Great Lakes, Illinois, and Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where their skills could be used to improve morale, inspire enlistments, sell war bonds, and satisfy the ego of sports-minded naval brass." Gene Woodling, who played with the Yankees after the war, said the Great Lakes squad may have been as good as the Yankees. "We hardly lost a ball game. We played all the major league clubs, all 16 of them. We beat them all. Never lost. That was in '44. The Great Lakes team in 1944 had 21 major leaguers, including Cy Johnson, Bob Klinger, Schoolboy Rowe, Virgil Trucks, Billy Herman, Johnny McCarthy, and was coached by Hall of Famer Mickey Cochran. Even Bob Feller would join the team in 1945. Many military commanders also took it as a matter of pride to put together the best possible baseball teams for their units. Pete Reeser of the Dodgers caught pneumonia following a 50-mile forced ruck march at Fort Riley, Kansas. Before he could be medically discharged, the commanding officer at Fort Riley decided to keep Reeser around to play for the team. Reeser said of the arrangement, "He writes out a pass for me from 0600 to 0600 daily. I can go any place I want. I also get a private room in the barracks, which made my hard-ass sergeant turn blue in the face, and no duties." I stayed there for a couple of years playing center field for Fort Riley. We ended up with a hell of a club. We had Joe Garagiola, Lonnie Frey, Creepy Crespi, Harry Walker, Al Brazel, Murray Dixon, Rex Barney, Ken Heitzelman. We whomped everybody we played. Reeser would end up injuring his shoulder while playing baseball at Fort Riley, which was one of the many injuries, including 5 skull fractures and 7 concussions from running into outfield walls, that cut what could have been a Hall of Fame career short. It wasn't as serious as the head injuries, but it did more to end my career. The shoulder kept popping out of place, more bone chips developed, and there was constant pain in the arm and shoulder. Outside of playing for the unit's baseball team, the most common job for a major leaguer in the military was running the physical fitness program or coordinating the unit's recreational sports programs. Much of the military members' overseas recreation centered around baseball. Red Munger of the Cardinals stated, "I was in charge of the athletic program of the 3rd Army. Nearly all the GIs over there are kids between 18 and 20 who never had it so good in their lives. We had 4 leagues of 6 clubs each. In addition to the 3rd Army League, there was the 1st, 3rd, and 9th Division loops. Those leagues were in Nuremberg after Germany had surrendered. And I have to say, I find it very poetic that they turned the main Nazi rally grounds into a baseball diamond. Chef's kiss." Some units didn't even require that much from their baseball players. Tex Houston, who played for an Army Air Force team in Hawaii and later in Saipan, stated, "I fought World War II with a baseball bat. All we did was play baseball. We didn't have any duties, we just played baseball every day." The absolute hotbed of baseball leagues in the military was Hawaii. Of the 125 players to make the War Going to War chart, at least 40 of them played in Hawaii at some point. There were a number of military leagues operating on the islands, including the American and National Leagues at Hickam Field, Ewa Plain League, Central Pacific Area League, Kaneohe Service League, 14th Naval District League, Pearl Harbor League, CB League, Hourglass League, Army Port and Service Command League, Fleet Marine Force League, Windward Oahu League, Oahu Army Baseball League, and there were also a number of civilian leagues where military teams entered, such as the Honolulu League, the Hawaii League, Hawaiian Defense League, and Paradise Baseball League. Eventually, the military was barred from participating in those civilian leagues in 1945 due to fears of military men making money for private citizens. The biggest series of the year in Hawaii was the annual Army-Navy Series, consisting of all-stars selected from all of the sub-leagues. It was a best-of-5 series in 1943 that Navy took 3 games to 2, and an 11-game series in 1944 that Navy won 8-2 with 1 tie. There was not an Army-Navy series in 1945, as both branches put together traveling teams to tour forward operating bases in the Pacific to entertain troops with exhibition games. The Navy tour included games at Majuro, Roy and Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, Ulithi, and Peleliu in the Caroline Islands, Saipan and Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas. The makeshift fields were usually freshly bulldozed and not in great condition. The original plan was for these players to play these games and then return to Hawaii, but instead, at the tour's conclusion in the Marianas, all of the players were assigned jobs on those islands. The Army tour included 3 teams selected from the best players in Hawaii, and at the time played in Tinian and Saipan at Army air bases to play for troops in between bombing missions to Japan. Tex Houston said of the arrangement in Saipan, "We have been busy building our own tents to live in and our own park to play in. The ballpark is no beauty, but will answer the purpose. Of course, there is no grass, and seats for customers are made exclusively of bomb crates, of which we have plenty here." Billy Hitchcock said, "They just bring in the Army trucks and jeeps and so forth and park them around the outfield grass beyond the little fence they built. The soldiers would pack all on those trucks. It was 12,000 there for that opening, just scattered everywhere, all over the field. didn't have much of a foul line because they were sitting there in foul territory. There was even a series played on Iwo Jima in August of 1945. Seabees cut a baseball field on the side of a hill on the island. Not all players enjoyed this focus on baseball, figuring they joined the military to serve in the military. Most notably, Joe DiMaggio. DiMaggio came to Hawaii in 1944 to play with the 7th Army Air Force Flyers to much fanfare and sold-out stadiums. While in Hawaii, DiMaggio suffered from a series of ailments, admitted to the hospital 4 times with symptoms related to an ulcer of the small intestine. They didn't get a correct diagnosis until his 4th visit. He lost 25 pounds and was eventually transferred to Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco. The psychiatric report on DiMaggio, written by a Major Stoloff, stated he felt he was exploited by being put on exhibition. And what is more, he feels not to profit of the Army, but rather to increase the income of civilians by gate receipts. He felt he was not treated as a soldier in the Army, but was permitted to be lionized as a baseball hero by autograph seekers. Stoloff concluded that DiMaggio felt he should have been utilized as a physical instructor throughout his time in the service, and showed a definite aversion to playing baseball while in the Army, stating if he wanted to play baseball, he could have stayed in civilian life and made $50,000 a year. While Major League military members did normally get roles at bases away from the front lines and dedicated a lot of their time to baseball, this was not true for every major leaguer. Many did serve in combat. We already talked about Cecil Travis getting frostbite during the Battle of the Bulge, but there's a few more. Buddy Lewis of the Nationals was a C-47 transport pilot that served in the China-Burma-India theater and flew over the Burma jungle. Lewis amassed 1,799 flying hours, of which 611 were in combat during 392 missions. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal. He stated after his service, "I've been away so long, I've practically forgotten baseball." With a friend stating he left for war and missed 4 years of baseball. He left a dark-haired man and came back to us at the end of 1945 with a full head of white hair and some hair-raising stories. Howie Christ of the Cardinals suffered a neck injury while diving into a foxhole. He also badly injured his leg while carrying ammunition and spent much of 1945 in a hospital in England. He was awarded the Purple Heart. Harry Walker and Al Brazel of the Cardinals, along with Ken Heitzelman of the Pirates, George Archie of the Browns, Rex Barney of the Dodgers, and George Sharon of the Phillies, were all assigned to the 65th Reconnaissance Troop Mechanized 65th Infantry Division in Europe. They breached the Siegfried Line in mid-March of 1945, crossed the Rhine at the end of the month, the Danube in late April, and reached Austria in May of 1945. Walker said, "We stayed pretty much together all through, went about 500 miles in combat." While holding a bridge, Walker was manning a machine gun on a Jeep while faced with an enemy that refused to stop. "So that's when I had to start shooting, and I just cut through the whole mess, and they were scattered everywhere, firing back and forth at you, and you're just out there on point like a sitting duck." Heintzelman later recalled, "I shot my share of Germans. How many? I don't know. I didn't bother trying to keep score. It was too dangerous." Barney was a tank commander roaming the advanced positions to draw enemy fire from sunup to sundown. He suffered shrapnel wounds to his leg and back while in Europe. Walker and Barney would both receive Bronze Stars, as well as 2 Purple Hearts for Barney and 1 for Walker. At the end of hostilities in Europe, the 6 played together on the 65th Infantry Division baseball team. "Our baseball really started about June," Heitzelman told the Sporting News. "We had to wait for most of our baseball equipment, and until it arrived, we had a German cobbler make our shoes, and we fixed our own spikes out of steel." There were also a lot of major leaguers that served in combat that didn't accumulate enough wins above replacement to make this chart, but they were major leaguers nonetheless. Earl Johnson of the Red Sox served with the 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division in the U.S. Army. The division landed on Omaha Beach and spearheaded the St. Lo breakthrough. Johnson was a rifle platoon sergeant and was awarded a Bronze Star. His citation read, "During heavy concentration of hostile fire, a friendly truck was struck by an enemy shell and had to be abandoned. The fact that the vehicle contained vital radio equipment made it imperative that it be recovered before falling into enemy hands. Sergeant Earl Johnson and several other members of his unit were assigned to this hazardous mission. They courageously braved severe hostile fire and were completely successful in dragging the vehicle over an area in plain view of the enemy." Months later, Johnson was awarded a Silver Star for bravery during the Battle of the Bulge and was promoted to first lieutenant. Johnson wrote, "I have been in combat for 6 months. It sure has been a long road. It really has been tough. It seems like I have been fighting for years. I sure will be glad when it is over." Jake Jones of the White Sox was a pilot on the USS Yorktown with 7 recorded kills on Japanese planes and was responsible for the sinking of at least 4 Japanese ships. A fellow Navy service member said of Jones, "Jake got to play some baseball between fights, but not too much. I recall once when he came back from a flight and we had quite a party that night. It was on the island of Maui. Next day, Jake played ball and got 2 home runs and a triple." Don Calloway of the White Sox was assigned to the 29th Infantry Division and saw combat in Europe, where he was awarded a Bronze Star. He said of his typical day in the Army before he deployed, "After a 4-hour hike with a full pack, we went through an hour of calisthenics. And then did we get back to our barracks to rest? We did not. We went to the mess hall to scrub for 2 hours. Wonder why I ever thought playing a doubleheader at second base was hard work." Jack Knott of the Athletics was first sergeant with Headquarters Company of the 104th Division, landed in France in September of 1944, took part in the Battle of Scheldt in Belgium, and participated in the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. In 1945, he received a battlefield commission and was awarded the Purple Heart. Johnny Grodzicki of the Cardinals served in the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 17th Airborne Division in Europe, and was dropped behind enemy lines in March of 1945 into Westphalia. While advancing on Münster, Grodzicki took shrapnel to his leg. He had to walk with a cane and steel brace after surgery. Amazingly, he pitched for the Cardinals after the war with the leg brace, and sports writer Bill Corum stated, "Johnny is plugged away, hour after hour and day after day. Kind-hearted Eddie Dyer has fretted over him and worked with him. Eddie loved his spirit and his stark refusal to accept defeat in his ambition to make the big time." Harvey Reeby of the Tigers was with the 66th Infantry Division. On Christmas Eve in 1944, 2,235 men from the unit were transported by the SS Leopoldville across the English Channel to France. A German U-boat struck the Leopoldville and her crew began to abandon ship, while the troops of the 66th Infantry Division remained in the troop compartments not knowing that the ship was sinking. The Leopoldville sank and Reeby spent 45 minutes in the water before being fished out by an English boat. 763 Americans lost their lives, including 2 minor league ball players, Howard DeMartini and Leonard Berry. On top of that ordeal, Reeby later took shrapnel in his right shoulder while fighting in France. He was awarded a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Skippy Roberge of the Brage was assigned to Company C, 4th Signal Company of the 4th Infantry Division, and was awarded a Purple Heart for wounds received during the Rohr River crossing at Linich, Germany. Bob Savage of the Athletics served with the 3rd Infantry Division in Italy. Savage described his experience. "My outfit left Naples and traveled by trucks, a few miles short of our destination. The rest of the journey was on foot. Sometimes during this walk, the enemy sent a barrage of mortar fire into our line of troops. Several of our boys were killed. I got hit in the back. Luckily, I'd put everything but the kitchen sink in my knapsack. It got torn to pieces, but just a small amount of shrapnel lodged in my back. It seemed that it wasn't very long before the medics got to us and moved the wounded to a safe area. There was an aid station very close to the front. We were all examined and then sent to a MASH-type hospital where the shrapnel was removed from my body. From there, we went to a hospital near Naples. Later in the war, his unit was part of the landings in southern France, where Savage was wounded for a second time. I was waiting across a small stream that had a one-way temporary bridge across the Rhine River. While waiting for traffic to go in my direction, I was standing next to my Jeep when an artillery shell landed close by. I hit the dirt but was still wounded on my leg, wrist, and face. When I got up, I realized I still had to get the Jeep across the stream. I was able to drive to my destination, which I think was no more than a mile away. I was taken to an aid station nearby and then transported to a hospital by an ambulance that had to pass over the same bridge where I had been wounded. Fighting had settled down, so we had no trouble during our journey. I was on the mend fairly soon after surgery, but I remained in the hospital for about 6 to 8 weeks. After returning to action, he was wounded for a third time. This time I was in a foxhole when a shell hit a tree and a flat piece of it hit me on the top of my head. This caused a pretty large bump. I went to a first aid station and the medics gave me a pill and sent me back to my unit. This injury did count for my 3rd Purple Heart, but it was my lucky one. On the last day of the war, everyone was firing their rifles in the air, and a spent bullet knocked my helmet off. I spent the rest of the day indoors. A few days before the end of the war, our division liberated the Dachau concentration camp. This has to be my worst memory. I haven't spoken about this experience more than 10 times in the last half century, and probably will not speak about it again. Lou Thuman of the Nationals was in the 175th Infantry Division in France, where he was hit on the right shoulder by a sniper. He spent the rest of 1944 in a hospital before being medically discharged from the military. The wound to his shoulder affected his pitching so much that he was never able to make it back to the majors again. Ken Trinkle of the Giants served with the 9th Armored Division and was awarded a Bronze Star for his actions during the Battle of the Bulge. Trinkle said, "I was a scout in a reconnaissance outfit. We would go out in front of the infantry and report if there was anything there. If you didn't come back, they knew there was something out there." Moe Berg, who was already retired from Major League Baseball before the U.S. entered the war, had perhaps the most interesting career after his playing days. I could probably make an entire video about him alone. In fact, Hollywood did just that. There was a movie starring Paul Rudd as Moe Berg made in 2018 called The Catcher Was a Spy. Allegedly fluent in 12 languages, Casey Stengel called Berg the strangest man to ever play baseball. In 1943, he was recruited to the Office of Strategic Services, what we call the CIA today. His most famous mission was to pose as a German businessman in Switzerland and attend a lecture by German theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg. Assess how close Heisenberg was to developing a nuclear bomb for the Germans, and if he was close, Berg was ordered to shoot Heisenberg on sight and take a cyanide pill to avoid capture. Berg assessed that Heisenberg and the Germans were not close to the A-bomb. Berg resigned from the OSS after the war. While major leaguers, for the most part, tended to avoid combat, minus the previously noted exceptions, this was not the case for most minor leaguers. While the major leagues had 2 players killed in action, at least 125 minor leaguers were killed in action. It's tough to get an official count. That's the minimum that historian Gary Bedingfield was able to confirm. Many minor leaguers were highly decorated, and to go into all of their stories would make this a 10-hour long video. This list I'm showing on screen is just medals by players that played in the majors at some point either before or after the war, and it's only what I was able to confirm, so there may be more. If I were to make this same list for anyone that played in the minors at some point in their lives, the list would be hundreds of names long, including 2 Medal of Honor recipients, Jack Lummis and Joe Pinder. For brevity's sake, I'll just tell you about those that went on to have Hall of Fame careers in the majors that served in combat. Outfielder Duke Snyder served as a fireman 3rd class on the submarine tender USS Sperry at Guam. In the book, The Duke of Flatbush, he said, "There was one close call when it looked as if I was going to find myself in combat after all. I was on watch duty on the number 1 5-inch gun when we sighted an unidentified ship ahead. The command came down from the bridge to load the gun with a star shell that would be fired if the ship did not respond to our signal requesting identification. No World Series moment ever scared me as much. I was no authority on loading or firing shells. All I had been told in our drills was that you press this lever, a shell comes up, you put it in, and press another lever, and the shell goes boom. I pressed the first lever, the shell came up, and I put it into the loading chamber. I was actually shaking while waiting for the command to fire. 2 ships might start firing at each other in the middle of the Pacific Ocean as a small part of World War II, and I was going to be the one to start the firing. Seconds before the command to fire would have come, the other ship identified itself as friendly. I needed an immediate change of underwear." Pitcher Hoyt Wilhelm served in the 395th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, and was awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received during the Battle of the Bulge. First baseman Gil Hodges served in the 16th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion and landed with the assault echelon at Okinawa. He was assigned to his battalion's Operations and Intelligence section. He was awarded a Bronze Star, and the citation stated that he was entrusted with the safeguarding and stenographic preparation of highly classified documents through extensive periods of enemy aerial assaults and extensive bombing attacks. Hodges said that he started smoking to have something to do sitting in those foxholes. Pitcher Warren Spahn served with the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, 1159th Engineer Combat Group, and was deployed to Europe in December of 1944. "We were surrounded in the Hurtgen Forest and had to fight our way out of there. Our feet were frozen when we went to sleep, and they were frozen when we woke up. We didn't have a bath or change of clothes for weeks." In March of 1945, his unit was tasked with maintaining traffic across the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the only remaining bridge to span the Rhine at the time. The bridge was under almost constant attack from Germans, who were desperate to stop the flow of Allied forces into Germany.
My unit, the Combat Engineer Battalion, worked hand in hand with a bridge construction outfit that was more or less in charge of erecting the dismembered pieces of iron and steel that were the upper part of the bridge. Ours was mainly the job of the flooring of the bridge. This was a railroad bridge, by the way. And we worked feverishly around the clock, 24 hours a day in different shifts to build a Bailey Bridge, to get treadway on the bridge so that we could give the boys some support or get some equipment to them that were fighting so hard on the other side of the river. During this time, there was constantly periods where enemy aircraft was coming in, strafing the bridge, dropping bombs trying to knock this bridge out. There was artillery fire. We stopped periodically to get under cover for these. This was a constant turmoil. It was men racing against time, that we needed help for those fellows over there, and we were working real hard, equipment flying all over the place.
Spahn was wounded in the foot by shrapnel while working on the bridge. He had just left the Ludendorff when the entire structure collapsed into the river with the loss of more than 30 Army engineers.
When suddenly we heard something like rifle fire, and we looked up in the air as if to look for aircraft, but instead there was dust coming up, rising from the bridge, and it seemed to totter a little, and it seemed to sway toward us. And then the center section of the bridge started to cave in. We had trucks up on the bridge that part of it was on the center section and part on the abutment side, so that this truck, I can remember, just folded up like an envelope. Pieces of equipment and pieces of the bridge were tumbling down. And I think our first reaction was to take cover that either the bridge had been hit or for some reason that it was going to fall. And then just as rapidly as you can well imagine, that whole big structure disappeared in front of us. And now we're all running to see what we can do about fishing people out of the river. That it was almost a bubbling, roaring noise that it almost seemed like the river itself had been turned into a boiling pot with all this debris falling in and men screaming, and you could see fellows were hurt and grasping for something to hang on to and going down the river, where eventually they were picked up. But ours was a case of real turmoil then.
The 276th received the Distinguished Unit emblem for its efforts to keep the bridge operating while under constant enemy fire, and Spahn received a Purple Heart and a battlefield commission as a second lieutenant. Catcher Yogi Berra was a gunner's mate on board a rocket-launching landing craft in the D-Day invasion at Omaha Beach.
What are your memories of that day?
Well, going in. It was amazing what I saw out there. All them guys out there.
You lost some people who were with you that day, right?
Oh, yeah.
What do you remember about them?
I think we lost about 3 of them. We had orders not to go on the beach with it. And they went on their own and they got it. That's it.
Elmer Gadian made his Major League debut for the Washington Nationals in 1939 at the age of 22. His Major League call-up that year was brief, only appearing in 5 games near the end of the season, and he would go on to spend 1940 in the minors with another call-up to Washington at the end of the year, but he didn't appear in any games that time. In spring training of 1941, he instead decided to join the Army, where he went into the Army Air Corps. While in flight training in North Carolina, Gadian was acting navigator on a B-25 that crashed upon takeoff. Gadian suffered 3 broken ribs, but managed to pull a crewmate from the flaming wreckage, saving his life. 2 men died in the crash, and Gadian was hospitalized for 3 months. He was promoted to first lieutenant and awarded the Soldier's Medal for his heroics. The citation read, "After extricating himself, Lieutenant Gadian, regardless of the fact that he had suffered broken ribs and severe shock, re-entered the burning wreckage and removed Corporal John R. Barrett, a fellow crew member, who had been rendered helpless due to having received a broken back and broken leg in the crash. Corporal Barrett would have burned to death had it not been for the unselfish action of Lieutenant Gadian, who, in addition to his other injuries, received severe burns on his back, right arm, and leg. The heroism displayed by Lieutenant Gadian on this occasion reflects great credit upon himself and the military service." 3 years later, Gadian was part of the 394th Bomb Group stationed in Boreham, England. On April 20th, 1944, Gadian was piloting a B-26 Marauder on a mission to bomb a German construction works in France. Gadian's plane was hit by flak, and only 1 crew member was able to escape the plane before it was engulfed in flames. Gadian and 5 other members of his crew died as the bomber crashed into the ground. He was buried in a cemetery at St. Pol, France, and his body was later returned to the United States, where it rests at Arlington National Cemetery today. Similar to Gadian, Harry O'Neill made his only appearance in the majors at the age of 22 in 1939, appearing in only 1 inning at catcher for the Philadelphia Athletics. O'Neill did not manage a single plate appearance. He spent time in the minors in 1940, but in 1941 opted to join the Marine Corps. In 1944, he reached the rank of first lieutenant and later shipped out to the Pacific Theater. As part of the 4th Marine Division, O'Neill took part in major amphibious assaults at Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima. On March 6, 1945, 3 weeks into the Battle of Iwo Jima, Lieutenant O'Neill was killed on the island. Gadian and O'Neill were the only 2 Major League Baseball players killed in action. These 2, along with the 125 minor leaguers killed in action, represent the largest sacrifice given by players during the war, but don't represent the only sacrifice. One of the reasons I wanted to make this video was not to just tell the story of what happened to baseball in World War II, but really explore a time and culture that seems nearly foreign today. We didn't see similar situations in professional sports during the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, or the wars in the Middle East. We didn't see every able-bodied person, or even non-able-bodied people, contributing to the war effort in the same way that we saw in World War II. When I look at this chart, I don't just see a list of players that missed time or impacted the league. I see a society-wide sacrifice. You have players giving up the one thing they know, the one unique talent they have that provides them a very nice career. A career with a limited shelf life that not only brings in decent pay, but provides notoriety. We still talk about Ruth, DiMaggio, Williams, Mays, and other baseball legends to this day. How many Medal of Honor recipients have the same level of widespread recognition? So to put that aside, even if it's to take a cushy job playing baseball at a stateside naval base in order to raise war bonds, is still a sacrifice. I can't even imagine the set of events or circumstances that would have to happen for something similar to happen today. So yes, this video is the story of baseball during World War II, but I think it's more than that. It's the story of how an entire country came together for a common cause throughout all facets of life. From the housewife collecting grease at home to donate to the cause, to kids taking the wheels off their bikes to donate the rubber, from those unable to fight in the war taking up manufacturing jobs to still be able to support the effort, to even Major League Baseball players setting aside their careers to raise war bonds in charity games or play on some remote Pacific island to brighten up some young GI's day who's in the middle of hell. It's a time period and culture that is extremely unique and worth exploring, and I hope I was able to do that. Thanks for watching.